Judge Harrison called her weak during the custody hearing, mocking her military service as playing soldier. The courtroom chuckled as he dismissed her rights as a mother. But when Sarah leaned forward and whispered, "Phoenix 7, her classified call sign from a CIA operation that had saved the president's life, the federal agents in the back stood up, and Judge Harrison's career ended that very day. From which city around the world are you watching today? If this story moves you, please subscribe to Rising Life Stories to help us share more stories of hidden heroes. But Phoenix 7 wasn't just any call sign. It was the classified designation for Operation Nightfall, where CIA operative Sarah Mitchell had single-handedly prevented an assassination attempt on the president during a state dinner in Berlin. Only 12 people in the world knew that call sign existed, and most of them worked in the highest levels of national security. What Judge Harrison didn't know was that Sarah's weak military service included 3 years as a deep-cover CIA operative, 2 presidential unit citations, and a classified commendation signed by the president himself. The federal agents sitting in his courtroom weren't there by coincidence. They were her former colleagues, attending to ensure her cover remained intact during the custody battle. The moment Sarah whispered, "Phoenix 7, those agents understood that their former team leader was blowing her cover to defend herself against a judge who had crossed a line. Within minutes, calls would be made to the highest levels of government, and Judge Harrison would discover that some people's service records are too classified to mock and too important to ignore. The Pierce County Family Court was filled with the familiar tension of custody battles, where parents fought over the most precious things in their lives while lawyers argued about visitation schedules and child support payments. But the case of Mitchell Mitchell carried an undercurrent of something deeper, a father's attempt to use his ex-wife's military service against her in their fight for their daughter. Sarah Mitchell sat at the defendant's table, dressed in a conservative blue suit that couldn't entirely hide the confident posture that came from years of high-stakes operations. At 35, she appeared to be exactly what her fabricated civilian identity suggested, a former Army intelligence analyst who had struggled to readjust to civilian life after her deployment. Her ex-husband, David Mitchell, had built his custody case around a simple but devastating argument. Sarah's military service had left her too damaged and unstable to be a proper mother to their 8-year-old daughter Emma. His attorney had gathered testimony from neighbors about Sarah's erratic behavior, her late-night activities, and her frequent unexplained absences from their suburban Seattle home. What David didn't know, what no one in the courtroom knew except for 2 men sitting quietly in the back row, was that Sarah's erratic behavior was actually the careful operational security of a CIA operative maintaining her cover identity. Her late-night activities weren't symptoms of PTSD, but classified briefings and covert operations that protected national security interests. Judge Robert Harrison presided over the hearing with the kind of old-fashioned authority that had defined his 25 years on the family court bench. At 62, Harrison represented a generation of judges who believed in traditional family values and had little patience for what he viewed as modern excuses for parental failures. Harrison had already formed an opinion about Sarah Mitchell based on the testimony he'd heard over the past 2 days. In his view, she was another veteran who had let military service interfere with her responsibilities as a wife and mother. The fact that she had refused to provide detailed explanations for her activities during the marriage only reinforced his prejudices. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the condescending tone he typically reserved for defendants he had already judged, "your ex-husband has presented compelling evidence that your military service has left you unfit to provide stable care for your daughter." Sarah's attorney, Jennifer Walsh, started to object, but Harrison waved her silent. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "your refusal to provide this court with detailed information about your activities during your marriage suggests that you have something to hide. This court has a responsibility to protect the welfare of minor children, and that means ensuring they are placed with the parent who can provide the most stable environment." In the back of the courtroom, 2 men in conservative suits listened with growing tension. Special Agent Michael Torres and Special Agent Lisa Park had been assigned to monitor the hearing to ensure that Sarah's cover identity remained intact. but they were becoming concerned that Judge Harrison's bias against military veterans might force Sarah to reveal classified information to defend herself. "Mrs. Mitchell," Harrison said, leaning forward with obvious disdain, "I want you to understand something about parenthood. Being a mother requires strength, stability, and the ability to put your children's needs above your own personal ambitions. Your military service, this playing soldier that you've used to avoid your family responsibilities, has clearly left you unable to fulfill those basic requirements." The courtroom fell silent. Several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that Harrison had crossed the line from judicial authority into personal attack. Sarah remained calm, but something in her posture changed. The carefully maintained facade of a struggling veteran began to give way to something else, the controlled intensity of someone who had faced far more serious challenges than a biased family court judge. "Your Honor," Sarah said quietly, "my military service was not playing soldier." Harrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the courtroom. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've seen dozens of cases like yours. Veterans who think their service entitles them to special consideration, who use their military experience as an excuse for their failures as parents and spouses." He paused, clearly building toward a conclusion that would end the hearing in David's favor. "The truth is, Mrs. Mitchell, that military service often attracts people who are running away from real responsibility. And in your case, that running away has made you too weak and unstable to be trusted with the care of a child." The word weak hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah's hands, which had remained steady through 3 years of covert operations that had taken her to 12 countries and put her life at risk countless times, trembled slightly as she absorbed the full impact of Harrison's judgment. In the back of the courtroom, Agents Torres and Park exchanged worried glances. They knew Sarah's real service record, and they understood that Harrison's characterization of her as weak was not just inaccurate. It was grotesquely insulting to someone who had risked everything to protect American lives. Sarah's attorney, Jennifer Walsh, stood up to object, but Harrison cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Ms. Walsh, your client has had 2 days to provide this court with specific information about her activities and qualifications. Instead, she has offered vague references to classified work that conveniently cannot be verified. This court deals in facts, not military fantasies." The courtroom spectators began to murmur, some clearly uncomfortable with Harrison's harsh treatment of a veteran, others nodding in agreement with his assessment. David Mitchell sat at the plaintiff's table with barely concealed satisfaction, understanding that Harrison's bias was delivering exactly the outcome he had hoped for. "Mrs. Mitchell," Harrison continued, "this court finds that your military service, rather than qualifying you for motherhood, has actually demonstrated your inability to prioritize your family's needs. Your secretive behavior, your frequent absences, and your apparent inability to maintain normal relationships all point to someone who is fundamentally unsuited for the responsibilities of parenting." Sarah looked at her daughter Emma, who sat in the court-appointed child advocate section, watching the proceedings with the kind of confusion that 8-year-olds experience when adults make decisions that don't make sense. Emma adored her mother and couldn't understand why the judge was saying such terrible things about the woman who had read her bedtime stories via video call from 3 different continents. "Therefore," Harrison announced, "this court awards primary custody to David Mitchell, with supervised visitation rights for Sarah Mitchell, pending completion of psychological evaluation and parenting classes." The gavel was already in Harrison's hand, poised to make the custody decision final, when Sarah stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a new quality that made several people in the courtroom sit up and pay attention. "May I approach the bench?" Harrison looked annoyed. "Mrs. Mitchell, the hearing is concluded. The court has made its decision based on the evidence presented." "Your Honor, I would like to provide additional information that may be relevant to the custody determination." Jennifer Walsh looked confused, knowing that she and Sarah had agreed not to reveal any classified information that might compromise national security. But something in Sarah's demeanor suggested that the rules of engagement had changed. "Mrs. Mitchell, if you had relevant information, you should have presented it during the hearing. This court will not be manipulated by last-minute theatrics." Sarah walked slowly toward the judge's bench, her movements controlled and purposeful. The federal agents in the back row tensed, understanding that their former colleague was about to do something that would have significant consequences for everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor," Sarah said, stopping directly in front of Harrison's bench, "you called me weak. You said my military service was playing soldier. You suggested that I was unfit to be a mother because I couldn't provide details about my activities during my marriage." Harrison leaned back in his chair, clearly irritated by what he perceived as a desperate attempt to delay his ruling. "Mrs. Mitchell, nothing you can say will change this court's assessment of your fitness as a parent. The evidence clearly shows." Sarah leaned forward, close enough to the judge's bench that only Harrison could hear her words. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the two words she spoke carried the weight of national security classifications and presidential-level authority. Phoenix 7. The change in the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. The moment Sarah whispered, "Phoenix 7, both federal agents in the back row stood up simultaneously, their faces showing a mixture of recognition, concern, and professional alertness that anyone trained in security protocols would immediately identify. Judge Harrison stared at Sarah with growing confusion. The call sign meant nothing to him, but the reaction from the two men in suits suggested that something significant had just happened. "What did you just say?" Harrison asked, his voice carrying less certainty than it had moments earlier. Sarah stepped back from the bench, her posture now fully transformed from that of a struggling veteran to something else entirely, the controlled confidence of someone who had operated at the highest levels of national security. "Phoenix 7, she repeated, this time loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "That's my operational call sign from Operation Nightfall, Berlin, March 2019. Agent Torres was already moving toward the front of the courtroom, his credentials ready to identify himself to the judge. Behind him, Agent Park was making rapid calls on her secure phone, alerting their superiors that a blown cover situation was developing. "Your Honor," Agent Torres announced, approaching the bench with his federal credentials displayed, "I'm Special Agent Michael Torres, Central Intelligence Agency. I need to speak with you immediately regarding matters of national security." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs as spectators tried to understand what was happening. David Mitchell looked around wildly, understanding that his custody case had somehow transformed into something far beyond his comprehension. Judge Harrison stared at the CIA credentials with the expression of someone whose world was rapidly shifting beyond recognition. "Agent Torres, I don't understand what this has to do with a custody hearing." "Your Honor, the woman you have been questioning is a former CIA operative whose service record is classified at the highest levels of government. The call sign she just mentioned relates to an operation that prevented a direct threat to the President of the United States." Sarah remained standing in front of the bench, her cover identity now completely abandoned. "Your Honor, for the past 3 years, I have been conducting covert operations in protection of American national security interests. My frequent absences from home, my inability to discuss my activities, and my secretive behavior were all part of maintaining operational security for missions that I cannot fully describe even now." Harrison's face had gone pale as the implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. "Are you telling me that Mrs. Mitchell is some kind of spy?" Agent Park approached the bench with a sealed folder. "Your Honor, we are authorized to provide you with a summary of Sarah Mitchell's service record, classified at a level that requires your immediate signature on several security agreements." The judge looked down at the folder as if it might explode. Inside were documents that would reveal Sarah's real identity. 3 years as a CIA operative, successful completion of 7 high-risk missions, 2 presidential unit citations, and a personal commendation from the president himself for preventing an assassination attempt that would have changed the course of American history. The call sign, Phoenix 7, Agent Torres explained, was assigned to Mrs. Mitchell during Operation Nightfall, where she identified and neutralized a terrorist cell that had infiltrated a state dinner in Berlin. Her actions prevented a direct attack on the president and saved the lives of 12 heads of state. Sarah looked at her daughter Emma, whose 8-year-old mind was trying to process the revelation that her mother was apparently some kind of real-life action hero. Your Honor, Sarah said, I couldn't provide details about my activities during my marriage because those activities were classified operations conducted in service to my country. My late-night absences weren't symptoms of instability. They were classified briefings and covert missions. My inability to maintain normal relationships wasn't a character flaw. It was operational security designed to protect both my family and my mission effectiveness. Judge Harrison sat in stunned silence as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He had spent the past 2 days humiliating and dismissing a woman whose service to her country operated at levels he couldn't even comprehend. Mrs. Mitchell, Harrison said, his voice now carrying none of its earlier condescension, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, Your Honor. That was the point. My cover identity was designed to be unremarkable, to allow me to operate without drawing attention to my real activities. The revelation of Sarah's true identity transformed the custody hearing into a national security briefing. Within minutes, additional federal agents had arrived at the courthouse to manage the security implications of a blown CIA cover, and courthouse security had cleared all non-essential personnel from the hearing room. Judge Harrison found himself signing security agreements that prohibited him from discussing what he had learned, while also trying to process the fact that he had just publicly humiliated one of America's most valuable intelligence assets. Mrs. Mitchell, Harrison said, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated, I owe you a profound apology. I made assumptions about your service and your character that were not just wrong, but deeply unfair to someone who has sacrificed so much for this country. Sarah nodded, understanding that Harrison's prejudices had been based on ignorance rather than malice. Your Honor, I don't need an apology. I need a custody decision based on the facts rather than on assumptions about military veterans. Agent Torres addressed the court. Your Honor, Sarah Mitchell's service record demonstrates the highest levels of reliability, judgment, and personal sacrifice. Her ability to maintain operational security while protecting her family's safety shows exactly the kind of strength and stability that any child would benefit from. David Mitchell, who had built his entire case around portraying Sarah as an unstable veteran, now found himself facing the reality that his ex-wife was actually a decorated intelligence operative whose instability was actually classified heroism. Your Honor, David's attorney said weakly, we would like to request a recess to reassess our position. Judge Harrison looked at the federal agents, at Sarah's security clearances, and at the little girl whose mother had apparently spent 3 years preventing terrorist attacks while still managing to attend parent-teacher conferences and soccer games. The court's previous ruling is vacated, Harrison announced. Based on new information regarding Mrs. Mitchell's service record and character, this court awards primary custody to Sarah Mitchell, with standard visitation rights for David Mitchell. But Harrison's ordeal was far from over. Within hours, his treatment of a classified CIA operative would be reported to judicial oversight committees, and his career would face scrutiny from officials who understood that some people's service records are too important to mock. 3 weeks later, Judge Robert Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing a letter from the Judicial Conduct Commission that would effectively end his career on the bench. The letter didn't mention Sarah Mitchell by name, but it made clear that Harrison's conduct during the custody hearing had demonstrated bias against military service members and a failure to maintain appropriate judicial temperament. Sarah Mitchell had disappeared back into whatever classified world she inhabited, taking her daughter Emma with her and leaving behind only the memory of 2 words that had changed everything: Phoenix 7. The federal agents who had witnessed Harrison's humiliation of their former colleague had filed reports that reached the highest levels of the intelligence community. Those reports documented not just Harrison's treatment of Sarah, but his dismissive attitude toward military service in general, and his apparent belief that veterans were inherently unstable. The custody case had been sealed under national security provisions, but word of Harrison's behavior had spread through the intelligence community and the judicial system. Other judges had begun reviewing their own attitudes toward military veterans, understanding that Harrison's career-ending mistake could happen to anyone who allowed prejudice to override professional judgment. Emma Mitchell, now living with her mother under a new identity in a location that would never appear on any public record, had learned that her mother's frequent absences hadn't been abandonment. They had been service to something larger than any individual family. Harrison's replacement on the family court bench was Judge Maria Santos, a former military lawyer who understood that service members often carried responsibilities that couldn't be explained in civilian courtrooms. 6 months after the custody hearing, Robert Harrison was working as a private attorney. His judicial career ended by his treatment of a woman whose service to her country he had dismissed as playing soldier. Sarah Mitchell continued her classified work, her cover identity rebuilt, and her daughter safe under the protection of the same government that had nearly lost custody of her because of one judge's prejudices. At Rising Life Stories, we believe that true strength often operates in shadows, protecting those who will never know the sacrifices made on their behalf. Sarah Mitchell's whispered call sign revealed not just her identity, but the invisible service that keeps our nation safe. Where are you watching from today? If this story of hidden heroism and ultimate justice inspired you, please subscribe, because there are heroes among us whose most important victories will never be celebrated publicly, and whose greatest strength is often mistaken for weakness by those who don't understand the cost of keeping others safe.